October 25, 1944. The Pacific sky stretched endlessly blue above Leyte Gulf, the kind of deceptive calm that makes men forget war exists. Sunlight danced across water so clear you could see shadows of fish darting beneath the surface. Above this tranquil scene, Japanese pilots banked their Zeros in lazy arcs, their voices crackling through radio channels with an ease that came from months of dominance. They laughed, actually laughed. One pilot spotted the American ships below, and his voice dripped with mockery as he transmitted to his squadron. Tin cans, he called them. Rust buckets, barely worth the ammunition. His wingman agreed, joking that sinking them would be like swatting flies with a sledgehammer. Overkill. Boring, even.
These weren't green recruits talking. These were veterans of Pearl Harbor, survivors of Midway's chaos, men who had strafed carriers and watched battleships burn. They had tasted victory so often it had become routine. Their confidence wasn't just swagger. It was earned through blood and fire across the Pacific theater. They had seen American ships flee. They had watched crews abandon their posts. The early months of the war had taught them that American resolve crumbled under pressure, that their technology couldn't match Japanese skill and ferocity. So when they looked down at those 7 small destroyers and destroyer escorts steaming in formation, they saw nothing worth respecting, just targets. Just another easy morning's work before breakfast.
But confidence has a shadow side. It blinds. It makes you stop asking questions. Those pilots never wondered why these particular ships hadn't scattered, never questioned why tin cans would position themselves between the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left and the vulnerable escort carriers beyond. Never considered that desperation makes men dangerous in ways that confidence never can. They saw what they expected to see: weak ships, inferior crews, another footnote in Japan's inevitable Pacific victory.
Down below, on those rust-streaked decks they mocked, American sailors heard the engines overhead. They knew what was coming. Some were teenagers who had never fired a gun in anger. Others were veterans who understood exactly how outmatched they were. Their destroyers carried torpedoes and 5-inch guns. The Japanese fleet, closing in behind those aircraft, mounted 18-inch cannons that could blow them apart from miles away. The math was simple, brutal, impossible. But what those laughing pilots didn't know, what their arrogance wouldn't let them see, was that those same tin cans were waiting to rewrite naval history. The Americans called their own ships tin cans, and they weren't joking. A destroyer's hull was barely thicker than a car door, thin enough that a direct hit from a cruiser's 8-inch shell would punch through both sides without slowing down. These weren't the mighty battleships that appeared on recruitment posters. They were the Navy's workhorses, built fast and cheap, designed to escort bigger ships and hunt submarines, never to slug it out with surface fleets in open combat. Their 5-inch guns could sting aircraft and smaller vessels, but against real warships, they were essentially firing spitballs at tanks. Each destroyer displaced around 2,000 tons. The Japanese battleships hunting them? 30,000 tons of armor and fury, with guns so massive their shells weighed more than a small car. The men who crewed these ships knew exactly what they were sailing. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college kids who had signed up after Pearl Harbor with stars in their eyes and received assignments to the Navy's least glamorous vessels. They scrubbed decks, loaded ammunition, and stood watch in the Pacific heat that turned metal decks into griddles. At night, squeezed into cramped berthing spaces that stank of sweat and fuel oil, they wrote letters home and tried not to think too hard about how little stood between them and the ocean. One sailor scrawled in his diary that serving on a destroyer was like riding a motorcycle into a demolition derby. You were fast, sure, but one good hit, and you became a smear. Another wrote that the ship's armor was so thin, he swore he could hear fish conversations through the hull. Dark humor kept them sane. They joked that their life vests were standard issue because the Navy expected them to need swimming lessons. They nicknamed their torpedoes Fish and their ship the Can, and laughed because the alternative was thinking too clearly about vulnerability. But beneath the jokes lived something else, a quiet understanding that when the moment came, they would do what needed doing. These weren't warriors chosen for courage. They were ordinary men, handed impossible odds, and no choice but to face them. They maintained their stations. They drilled. They waited.
What none of them knew yet was that within hours, their fragile tin cans would charge directly at the most powerful battleship force in the Pacific. 10 times their size, 100 times their firepower. A battle so lopsided that naval historians would later call it suicide. And yet, they would attack anyway. By autumn 1944, the Pacific War had become a slow strangulation. Island by island, the United States was tightening a noose around Japan's throat. The Philippines stood as the next target, a strategic prize that would sever Japan's supply lines to the oil and resources of Southeast Asia. Lose the Philippines, and Japan's war machine would starve. Tokyo knew this. Washington knew this. The outcome would hinge on one massive confrontation. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was assembling itself like pieces on history's largest chessboard. More ships would clash here than in any naval engagement before or since. Hundreds of vessels, thousands of aircraft, nearly 200,000 men whose fates would be decided across 4 separate but interconnected battles spanning 3 days. The Americans were landing troops on Leyte Island itself, pouring men and material onto beaches while the Navy provided cover and support. Japan's response was desperate and brilliant in equal measure. They devised a plan so audacious it seemed pulled from fiction. Use their remaining carriers as bait to lure the main American fleet north, then send their powerful surface ships through undefended passages to slaughter the vulnerable landing forces. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, the spearhead of this gambit. His fleet was a museum of Japanese naval might. The battleship Yamato, largest and most powerful ever built, its 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells the size of small cars over 20 miles. The battleship Congo and her sisters, fast and deadly. Heavy cruisers bristling with 8-inch cannons. Light cruisers, destroyers. Together they formed a sledgehammer designed to crush anything in their path. Kurita's orders were clear. Break through San Bernardino Strait, sweep south, and annihilate the American invasion fleet. Standing between Kurita and those troop transports was Taffy 3, a small escort carrier group commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. 6 escort carriers, essentially cargo ships with flight decks welded on top. 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Their job was never combat. They were there to provide air support against submarines and land targets, to patrol empty ocean, to be useful without being heroic. Sprague's ships carried pilots flying obsolete aircraft loaded with bombs meant for ground troops, not armor-piercing weapons for battleships. They were a speed bump pretending to be a blockade.
And then, Through the morning mist off Samar Island, dark shapes appeared on the horizon, pagoda masts rising like temples, massive hulls cutting through swells, battleships where none should be. The first salvo arrived before most men understood what was happening. Geysers of water erupted 3 stories high, white columns crowned with spray that caught the morning light like crystal. Beautiful if you didn't know what they meant. The sound followed seconds later, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the sky itself rather than the horizon. Sailors on the American destroyers froze mid-task, their minds struggling to process the impossible. Those splashes meant battleship guns, but there were no enemy battleships within 300 miles. Intelligence had promised this. The fleet had believed it. Another salvo screamed overhead with a sound like freight trains tearing through fabric. These shells didn't miss by much. Water crashed across decks, drenching men who now understood with terrible clarity that they were being hunted. On the bridge of the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague grabbed binoculars and swept the horizon, his hands steady despite what his mind was screaming. Pagoda masts. 4, no, 6 of them. The distinctive silhouettes of Japanese heavy ships emerging from a rain squall like ghosts, materializing into flesh. His blood turned to ice water. The center force wasn't supposed to be here. Halsey's battleships were supposed to be guarding San Bernardino Strait. Someone had made a catastrophic mistake, and now Sprague's tiny escort group faced the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still muster.
The range closed with horrifying speed. Japanese shells began finding their rhythm, walking closer to the carriers with each salvo. An 8-inch round struck the destroyer Hoel, punching through her thin hull and exploding in a berthing compartment. Men vanished in an instant, transformed from living, breathing souls into pink mist and shrapnel. Fire bloomed amidships. Damage control teams scrambled through smoke so thick it burned their throats. The smell of cordite mixed with something worse, burning flesh, melting insulation, hot metal, and terror. On the carriers, flight deck crews frantically armed and launched every aircraft they had, even knowing their bombs couldn't penetrate battleship armor. Pilots climbed into cockpits with whatever ordnance was closest, depth charges meant for submarines, fragmentation bombs for infantry, some with nothing but their machine guns and raw courage. The sky filled with planes making attack runs that were more gesture than threat, anything to distract those massive guns from the ships below. The ocean burned with near misses. Smoke from hits and deliberate smoke screens turned morning into twilight. Chaos became the only constant. This was annihilation in slow motion, a mismatch so severe that survival seemed impossible. Yet instead of running, the tin cans charged. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston, watching 18-inch shells bracket his ship with water columns that towered above his mast. The rational choice was retreat, run for rain squalls, hide in smoke, buy time for the carriers to escape while his destroyers scattered like rabbits before wolves. Every tactical manual ever written screamed this truth. Instead, Evans turned to his crew with eyes that held something beyond sanity, beyond fear. "We're going in," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Anyone who doesn't want to go can get off now." Nobody moved. They were already sprinting toward the enemy at flank speed, black smoke pouring from Johnston's stacks as her engines screamed past their rated capacity. Behind Johnston, commanders on Hoel and Herman received the same impossible data and made the same impossible choice. 3 tin cans, their combined tonnage less than a single Japanese battleship, aimed their bows directly at Kurita's center mass and opened their throttles. They weren't retreating, they were attacking. The audacity was so profound that Japanese gunners hesitated, their training failing to account for prey that charged predators. Radio chatter on Japanese frequencies devolved into confusion. American destroyers don't do this. Small ships don't attack battle lines. This violated every assumption, every lesson of naval warfare stretching back centuries. Johnston closed to 10,000 yards, then 8,000, shells screaming past her superstructure close enough that sailors felt displacement winds. Her 5-inch guns barked continuously, a terrier snapping at a bear's ankles, doing no real damage but forcing Japanese crews to take cover, disrupting fire control, creating chaos. At 5,000 yards, Evans gave the order. Torpedoes away. 10 long lances of compressed air and high explosive dropped from their tubes and hit the water running, leaving phosphorescent trails as they accelerated toward 43 knots.
Hoel and Heermann followed, their torpedo spreads fanning out in a deadly pattern that forced the Japanese formation to twist and turn like dancers avoiding landmines. The battleships and cruisers broke their neat attack columns, ships peeling away from torpedo wakes, captains shouting contradictory orders, the precision of their assault disintegrating into self-preservation. One spread from Johnston tracked true, cutting through swells with mechanical determination, closing the distance to the battleship Congo. The explosion sent a pillar of water and steel skyward. Congo shuddered, 32,000 tons of warship convulsing as a torpedo opened her hull below the waterline. The first giant stumbled.
Above the churning battle space, American pilots did something unprecedented. They had already emptied their guns in the first frantic runs, expended their few anti-personnel bombs that barely scratched paint on armored decks. Standard procedure dictated returning to carriers to rearm, to wait for proper ordnance. But there was no time. The destroyers below were dying. The carriers were minutes from being obliterated. So the pilots turned around and attacked again with empty weapons. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable made his approach on a Japanese cruiser with nothing in his bomb bay but air and determination. He dove anyway, pushing his Avenger into a textbook attack profile that forced the cruiser's captain to order evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around him in black puffs of shrapnel. He pulled up at the last second, having dropped absolutely nothing, and banked away while the cruiser wasted precious seconds zigzagging from a threat that never existed. Behind him, 3 more pilots repeated the performance. Ghost attacks, phantom threats, psychological warfare conducted by men who understood they were writing checks their ordnance couldn't cash.
Other pilots got creative in ways that bordered on insanity. They dropped depth charges set for shallow detonation, creating geysers that looked like near misses, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver. Some stripped their machine guns down to bare minimums of ammunition and made strafing runs across battleship bridges, bullets sparking off armor plating but sending officers diving for cover. One pilot jury-rigged smoke floats meant for marking downed aviators and dropped them on the water to create false screening, anything to buy seconds. On the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Kurita watched this circus of desperation through increasingly confused eyes. His radio operators translated frantic reports from ship captains, torpedo wakes everywhere, aircraft attacking in waves, destroyers charging like they were capital ships. The Americans weren't fighting to win. They were fighting like cornered animals, all teeth and fury and absolute refusal to accept reality. This wasn't in the playbook.
Kurita had fought Americans before. They were methodical, cautious, they valued their ships and withdrew when outmatched. These men were different. These men were beyond reason. The sea had become a cauldron of smoke, fire, and churning wakes. The sky rained both steel and courage. Explosions bloomed across the water like deadly flowers. Ships burned, men died, and through it all, the impossible held. The carriers still lived. The landing beaches remained protected.
And then Yamato, the largest warship ever built, swung her massive 18-inch turrets toward the nearest American destroyer. Yamato's main guns elevated with mechanical precision, each barrel 75 feet of rifled steel, capable of hurling a shell weighing more than a Volkswagen Beetle. When they fired, the concussion was visible. A rippling shock wave spread across the water, flattening waves, vibrating through the hulls of ships miles away. The sound wasn't just loud, it was fundamental, a bass note that resonated in bone marrow and made men's hearts stutter in their chests. This was what peak human engineering looked like when devoted entirely to destruction. Yamato was a fortress that sailed, armor 26 inches thick in places, more than twice the thickness of a destroyer's entire beam. She was physics made manifest, mathematics expressed in armor plate and explosive force. Her first salvo at the destroyer Hoel created water columns so massive they blocked out the sun. The shells missed, but the displacement from their near impact lifted Hoel's bow clear out of the water, metal groaning as forces tried to break her keel. Sailors tumbled across decks, equipment tore loose. The ship crashed back down, everyone aboard understanding with absolute clarity that a direct hit wouldn't sink them, it would vaporize them. There would be no time to abandon ship, no chance for survival. One moment you'd exist, the next you wouldn't. Yet Hoel's commander ordered another torpedo run, straight at Yamato. The destroyer weaved through a forest of shell splashes, each near miss sending tons of seawater cascading across her decks. Her 5-inch guns fired continuously at a target they couldn't seriously harm, but the muzzle flashes and shell impacts forced Yamato's fire control teams to flinch, disrupted their calculations, bought seconds. Those seconds were everything.
On Yamato's bridge, officers watched in disbelief as the destroyer refused to die. Captain Koryanagi turned to Admiral Kurita with something approaching awe in his voice. "They're not running. Why aren't they running?" Kurita had no answer. The Americans had lost their minds. That was the only explanation. Rational men didn't charge battleships in destroyers. Sane commanders withdrew when facing 10-to-1 odds. But these men kept coming, kept shooting, kept launching torpedoes, kept forcing his mighty fleet to dodge and weave like they were the ones outgunned. Then a lookout screamed a warning. "Torpedo wakes! 3 of them, tracking toward Yamato's starboard quarter." Kurita shouted orders. The massive ship began a ponderous turn, her enormous mass fighting momentum, thousands of tons pivoting with agonizing slowness. The torpedoes missed by meters. Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was being forced to run defense against ships that barely qualified as military vessels. The ocean boiled with fire, shell splashes creating a landscape of temporary waterfalls and spray. Smoke obscured everything. Ships appeared and vanished like ghosts in the haze. Explosions marked death and near death in equal measure. And somehow, impossibly, some of the American destroyers were still afloat.
Admiral Kurita paced Yamato's flag bridge like a caged animal, reports flooding in from every quadrant, creating a mosaic of chaos that defied comprehension. His heavy cruisers, Chokai and Chikuma, were crippled, limping through smoke with gaping wounds below their waterlines. Torpedo wakes crisscrossed his formation from impossible angles. Aircraft swarmed his fleet in waves that seemed endless. His radio operators intercepted American transmissions that suggested massive reinforcements closing fast. Fire control officers reported losing track of targets in the smoke and spray, unable to distinguish destroyer escorts from cruisers, small carriers from fleet carriers. Everything had dissolved into sensory overload and fragmentary data that painted a picture of American strength that couldn't possibly be accurate, but felt overwhelmingly real. He made the call at 0911 hours. All ships, break off attack, withdraw north. The order rippled through the Japanese formation with the shock of heresy. They had been winning. The Americans were clearly outmatched. Victory had been inevitable just an hour ago. But Kurita's reasoning followed a brutal logic. If this small escort group could fight with such ferocity, what awaited beyond the smoke? If destroyers charged battleships without hesitation, what would the real American fleet do when it arrived? His intelligence was clearly wrong. The Americans wouldn't defend invasion beaches with just escort carriers and tin cans. This had to be the vanguard, the trap's outer edge. Stay any longer, and the jaws would close.
The withdrawal began with massive ships heeling over in emergency turns, their wakes carving white scars across blue water. Japanese destroyers laid smoke to cover the retreat. Within 20 minutes, the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still muster was running from 7 destroyers, 6 escort carriers, and a handful of obsolete aircraft. The Americans didn't even realize it was happening at first. Sailors aboard the survivors kept expecting the final blow, the salvo that would finish what had started. Instead, the shell splashes grew more distant. The pagoda masts shrank toward the horizon. The thunder of big guns faded. On the carrier Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Spragg lowered his binoculars with hands that suddenly wouldn't stop shaking. His operations officer stared at the retreating shapes with an expression somewhere between shock and religious epiphany. "They're leaving," he whispered, as if speaking louder might break the spell. "They're actually leaving." Aboard a circling Japanese reconnaissance plane, Lieutenant Sakamoto radioed his base with a voice tight with confusion. "Enemy fleet withdrawing south. Our fleet withdrawing north. Heavy damage both sides. American strength greater than estimated." He paused, struggling with what he witnessed. Their small ships fought like battleships. Their pilots attacked without weapons. I have never seen such... He couldn't find the word. Madness? Courage? The line between them had blurred beyond recognition. In Tokyo, when the reports finally reached Naval General Staff Headquarters, officers refused to believe them. Destroyers had forced Yamato to retreat? Impossible. There must be errors in translation. Yet the damage reports were real. Ships limping home, casualties mounting, and the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf remained untouched, still pouring troops and supplies onto Philippine beaches, still operating as if the most powerful Japanese surface force hadn't just been repelled by vessels that shouldn't have survived the first salvo. USS Johnston died the way she had fought, defiant to the last breath. By 0945 hours, she had taken so many hits that counting them became meaningless. Shells had torn through her bridge, killing or wounding nearly everyone there. Her engine room flooded, power failed, fires consumed her superstructure.
She was dead in the water, listing heavily, surrounded by Japanese cruisers that circled like sharks sensing blood. Commander Ernest Evans, wounded multiple times, his khaki uniform dark with blood, stood on what remained of his bridge and gave his final orders. "Abandon ship. Save yourselves." His crew hesitated, unwilling to leave their captain. He made it a direct command. They went over the side into an ocean slicked with oil and debris, swimming away from their home as she settled lower into the swells. Japanese destroyer Yukizaka closed to 400 yards and fired a final salvo. Johnston shuddered, rolled to port, and slipped beneath the surface bow first, her screws still visible above water for a moment before she vanished completely. Survivors in the water reported that officers aboard Yukizaka stood at attention and saluted as she went down. Even enemies recognized what they had witnessed. Commander Ernest Evans was never found. He went down with his ship, as captains sometimes do, his body claimed by the same ocean he had defied.
The destroyer Hoel followed Johnston into the deep after taking 40 direct hits. Her crew abandoned ship in good order, men helping wounded shipmates into the water, sharing life jackets, forming groups to stay together. They floated for 2 days before rescue found them. In that time, sharks came. Men died from wounds, from exposure, from simply giving up. Those who survived told stories of petty officers keeping spirits up with bad jokes, of officers sharing their rations, of strangers becoming brothers in the space between life and death. Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort even smaller than the destroyers, earned the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship before she too succumbed to damage no ship her size should have survived. Her crew fired every shell they had, over 600 rounds, until their gun barrels glowed red and ammunition ran dry. When she sank, her men sang in the water to keep morale up, their voices carrying across the swells like defiance made audible. The butcher's bill was brutal. Over 1,000 American sailors killed or missing, 3 destroyers sunk, multiple ships crippled. Families back home would receive telegrams with clinical language about sacrifice and honor, words that could never capture the reality of what their sons and husbands had done.
But they had stopped Yamato. They had saved the invasion fleet. Courage, it turned out, wasn't measured by tonnage or firepower. It was measured by the willingness to charge forward when everything rational screamed retreat. By choosing impossible action over certain death through inaction. The tin cans had been fragile, but the men inside them had been unbreakable. In the decades following the war, something remarkable happened in the quiet spaces where veterans gather and history gets written honestly. Japanese naval officers who had survived the Battle off Samar began speaking at conferences and writing memoirs, and their words carried a weight that transcended national allegiance. Captain Koyanagi, who had stood on Yamato's bridge that morning, wrote that he had faced American carriers and battleships throughout the Pacific, but never had he encountered warriors like those destroyer crews. They fought, he wrote, as if they did not know they could die. Another Japanese commander, when asked years later about the engagement, shook his head slowly and said something that translators struggled to capture fully. The essence was this: warriors recognize warriors, regardless of flag or uniform. What those American sailors did wasn't tactics, it was transcendence. They had crossed a threshold where calculation ends and pure will takes over. In Japanese military tradition, There was profound respect for such spirit. They had a word for it: Yamato Damashi, the spirit of fighting beyond reason, beyond hope, for something larger than survival. The Americans had shown it more clearly than Japan's own forces that day.
The transformation in how history remembered these ships was equally profound. Naval academies around the world began teaching the Battle off Samar as a case study in courage under impossible odds. The tin cans that crews had named with self-deprecating humor became sacred designations: USS Johnston, USS Hoel, USS Samuel B. Roberts. Their names were engraved on memorials, spoken with reverence in officer training, held up as standards against which all naval courage would be measured. Books with titles like Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors became bestsellers. Documentaries retraced their final moments. Survivors were invited to speak at Pearl Harbor ceremonies and given standing ovations by audiences who finally understood what they had done. The Pacific Ocean holds their graves now, steel tombs in crushing darkness, thousands of feet below where morning light once glittered on calm water. But their story refuses to stay buried. It surfaces in every discussion of what humans can accomplish when pushed beyond breaking points. It echoes in every underdog tale, every moment when someone small stands against something overwhelming and refuses to yield. Once they were laughed at, rust buckets barely worth the ammunition. Now they are immortal. The laughter died that October morning off Samar. What rose in its place was something infinitely more powerful: legend, reverence, truth. The tin cans had been fragile, yes, but fragility armed with courage becomes something that even battleships must respect. They charged into gunfire that should have erased them, and in doing so, they wrote themselves into the eternal company of warriors who prove that size matters far less than spirit. The Japanese pilots who mocked them learned this lesson the hardest way possible. So did history, and so do we every time their story is told. Every time someone asks what courage really looks like when stripped of pretense and pride, it looks like 7 small ships, impossibly outgunned, turning toward their destroyers and charging.